The dog would not be quiet, not even for the dead, not even for the flag, not even for the silence that wrapped the cemetery like a final prayer. And in that moment, before anyone understood why, something deeper than grief had already begun to surface. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The morning air in Arlington hung cold and still, just under 50 degrees, the kind of chill that settles into your bones and stays there. The sky a pale gray stretched thin over rows of white headstones standing like quiet witnesses, each one holding a story no one wanted to tell out loud. And at the center of it all stood a polished oak coffin draped in a folded American flag, edges crisp, colors muted under the overcast light. A line of officers in dress blues standing shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, their breath barely visible in the air, boots planted firm against the damp grass. And somewhere between the sound of a distant breeze and the soft rustle of fabric, a single bark shattered the stillness. It came sharp, sudden, too loud for a place like this, and every head turned at once, not toward the coffin, but toward the German shepherd straining against a firm grip, muscles taut, ears pinned forward, eyes locked onto the casket as if it were something alive, something wrong, something that didn't belong. Easy, Rex, the handler whispered under his breath, tightening his hold on the leash. But Rex didn't ease, didn't settle, didn't even blink, his chest rising and falling in short, controlled bursts. Not panic, not fear, something else, something focused, something deliberate. Another bark followed, deeper this time, echoing across the rows of stone and into the silence beyond, and it lingered there, hanging in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. People shifted uncomfortably. A few murmurs passed. Between officers, subtle, restrained, the kind of quiet confusion trained men carry when something doesn't fit the order of things, and yet no one stepped forward to stop it. Not yet, because there was something in the way the dog stood, not wild, not out of control, but anchored, like he had found something no one else could see. The coffin remained still, untouched, but Rex leaned forward again, paws digging slightly into the wet ground, nose lifting just enough to catch the faint scent, drifting through the cold air, and for a moment, just a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single line between the dog and the box that held a man everyone believed was gone. The chaplain paused mid-prayer, his voice trailing off into uncertainty, the words dissolving before they could find meaning, and even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for something unseen to reveal itself. Rex let out a low growl now, deep and controlled, not aggressive, but insistent, a warning, spoken in a language older than words, and his handler felt it. The shift, the tension traveling up the leash like a current, raising something uneasy in his chest, something he couldn't name. He's just grieving, someone whispered from the line, but the words felt thin, hollow, like they didn't quite reach the truth standing right in front of them, because grief didn't look like this. Not in a dog trained to hold steady under gunfire. Not in a partner who had spent years beside a man whose heartbeat he could recognize in a crowded room, whose scent he could track across miles of asphalt and dust. This was something else, something sharper, something that refused to sit quietly and accept what it was being told. Rex barked again, louder, pulling harder now, forcing a step forward, and the handler's grip slipped just enough for the leash to stretch tight between them. A single inch of movement that felt like a line being crossed. And that was when the first crack in certainty began to show, not in the coffin, not in the ceremony, but in the eyes of the men who had seen too much to ignore instinct when it spoke this clearly. The dog wasn't mourning, he was insisting, he was calling. Something out, something hidden beneath layers of assumption and protocol, something that did not belong in a place meant for final goodbyes. And as the silence fractured around him, one thing became impossible to deny. Rex wasn't trying to say goodbye, he was trying to stop it. The leash slipped another inch, and that was all it took for the illusion to begin unraveling. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet way truth often does, like a crack forming beneath ice no one realized was thin. Officer Mark Delaney tightened his grip again, jaw set, eyes flicking from Rex to the coffin and back as if trying to anchor himself to something that still made sense. But the dog would not yield. His body angled forward, weight shifted onto his front legs, every muscle aligned with a single purpose that refused to be dismissed as grief. Around them, the formation held, but barely, shoulders stiff, glances exchanged in silence. The kind of looks that carried questions no one wanted to voice during a ceremony meant for closure. The flag on the coffin stirred slightly as a faint breeze moved through, and for a brief second, it caught the light in a way that made it seem almost unreal, like a photograph rather than something present, something final. Rex let out another sound, not a bark this time, but a low, sustained whine that seemed to pull from somewhere deeper than instinct. Something learned over years beside a man who had trusted him with decisions that could not be explained, only felt. Mark exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and leaned down just enough to bring his voice closer to the dog's ear. "Talk to me, partner," he murmured, not expecting an answer, but needing to say it anyway, because this was not the first time Rex had refused to follow expectation, and it had never been without reason. A memory flickered through his mind, quick and uninvited, of a training yard under a harsh summer sun, temperatures pushing past 90 degrees, asphalt radiating heat in waves. Rex, younger then, leaner, standing perfectly still while another officer insisted the target area was clear, and yet the dog had not moved, had not complied, had simply waited, eyes fixed on a single spot until they checked again and found what everyone else had missed. Mark swallowed, the weight of that memory settling into the present moment like a warning. Behind him, a senior officer stepped closer, voice low but firm. "Control your dog, Delaney." The words measured, respectful, but edged with urgency, because ceremony had rules, and this was not how it was supposed to go. Mark nodded slightly, though his eyes did not leave Rex, and for a second, he considered pulling him back, forcing compliance, ending the disruption before it spread any further. But something in the dog's posture stopped him, something that did not match chaos or confusion, but clarity, a kind of certainty that did not ask for permission. Rex shifted again, nose lifting higher now, drawing in the air with deliberate focus, as if searching for a trace that did not belong. And then he stepped sideways, just a fraction, adjusting his angle toward the coffin, and his ears twitched sharply, locking into place. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but Mark felt it like a signal, the same way he had felt it on long nights when silence mattered more than sound. "Sir," Mark said quietly, straightening just enough to address the officer beside him. "This is not random," his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the words hang longer than they should have. The officer hesitated, just a beat, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked from the dog to the coffin, then back to Mark, and in that hesitation, doubt found its way in. The chaplain stood still now, hands folded, waiting, the prayer unfinished, suspended in the space between what was supposed to happen and what was actually unfolding. Rex barked again, sharper this time, and pulled forward with more force, enough that Mark had to take a step with him to keep balance, boots pressing into the damp ground, leaving a clear mark where he stood. A few steps away, one of the pallbearers shifted his stance, eyes fixed on the dog, something uneasy rising behind his composed expression, because even without understanding, there was something unmistakable in the way Rex refused to stand down. This was not noise, not disruption. This was insistence, and it carried a quiet authority that did not belong to ceremony or rank, but to something older, something earned. Mark's grip loosened, not by accident this time, but by choice, just enough to give Rex a little more room, a little more truth to work with, and the moment he did, the dog moved forward again, closer now to the coffin, close enough that the distance between them no longer felt symbolic, but immediate. The air seemed to tighten around them, every sound dimming except for the steady rhythm of Rex's breathing and the faint rustle of fabric against wood. And in that narrowing space, one thought settled into Mark's mind with quiet certainty. If Rex was wrong, this would end here. But if Rex was right, then everything they believed about the man inside that coffin was about to change. The distance between Rex and the coffin closed to less than 3 feet, and the closer he got, The more precise his movements became, no longer pulling blindly but stepping with intention, each paw placed carefully on the damp grass, as if he were following a path only he could see. And Mark felt it again. That same quiet signal he had learned not to ignore, the kind that did not come from noise but from stillness sharpened into purpose. Rex lowered his head slightly, drawing in the air with slow, measured breaths, not frantic, not confused, but deliberate. And then he stopped, completely still, his body locked in place, ears forward, tail steady, every part of him aligned toward the coffin as if the world behind him no longer existed. The officers nearby shifted again, tension rising in subtle ways, a hand adjusting a glove, a foot repositioning on the grass. Small movements that betrayed a growing awareness that something was unfolding beyond protocol. Mark stepped closer behind Rex, shortening the leash just enough to stay connected. But he did not pull him back, not anymore, because whatever this was, it had moved beyond control and into something that demanded attention. "What is he doing?" One of the younger officers whispered, his voice barely carrying past the line, but no one answered, because no one had an answer that felt certain enough to speak out loud. Rex's nose hovered inches from the side of the coffin now, just below the folded edge of the flag, and he inhaled again, deeper this time, holding the scent for a fraction longer, and then his head tilted slightly to the side, a small, precise motion that Mark had seen before, the exact moment when Rex separated what belonged from what did not. A faint breeze moved through again, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and polished wood, but beneath it, something else lingered, something Rex caught and held onto, something that did not match the memory he carried of the man they had both known. Mark's heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from focus, the way it used to before decisions that could not be undone, and he crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Rex's level, his voice low, steady. "You are telling me something, aren't you?" he said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Rex responded not with a bark, but with a soft, controlled huff, and then he shifted again, stepping to the side of the coffin, tracing its length slowly, his nose gliding just above the surface, mapping it, reading it, and when he reached the far end, he stopped again, more abruptly this time, his posture tightening as if he had reached the edge of something important. The silence around them deepened, pressing in from all sides, even the distant sounds of the cemetery fading into the background as attention narrowed to the space between. The dog in the box. Mark rose to his feet, his eyes lifting toward the senior officer who had spoken earlier, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. But something had shifted in that look, something that replaced certainty with the possibility of doubt. "Sir," Mark said again, more firmly now, "this is not a reaction to loss." His voice calm, but carrying a weight that made it impossible to dismiss. "This is detection." The word landed differently, heavier, because it belonged to a different set of rules, a different kind of response. The officer hesitated, his gaze moving from Mark to Rex, then to the coffin, and for the first time, he took a step closer, breaking the invisible boundary that had kept the ceremony intact. Rex let out a low sound again, not loud, but insistent, and he placed one paw forward, touching the base of the coffin gently, not striking, not scratching, just resting it there as if marking a point, a signal, a place that needed to be seen. Mark felt a tightening in his chest, not fear, but the weight of what came next, because once doubt entered a moment like this, it could not be undone. The chaplain lowered his hands completely now, stepping back just slightly, giving space without being told, as if even he could sense that something beyond ritual had taken hold. The flag shifted again, a corner lifting just enough to reveal the smooth grain of the wood beneath, and for a second, the entire scene felt suspended, like time itself had slowed to wait for a decision. Mark glanced once more at Rex, at the unwavering focus in his eyes, the same focus that had never failed him before. And then he looked back at the officer, his voice quiet but certain. "We need to check." And in that moment, the ceremony was no longer about saying goodbye. It was about uncovering a truth that refused to stay buried. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire ceremony had been placed on hold by something unseen, something that had quietly stepped in and demanded to be heard. And in that stillness, The weight of Mark's words settled over the gathered officers like a question that could no longer be ignored. The senior officer, Captain Howard Briggs, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture firm, disciplined, but his eyes betrayed a shift, a calculation, the kind that came from years of command when instinct and procedure collided, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the coffin by 2 measured steps, his polished shoes pressing into the damp ground with a soft, deliberate sound. Rex did not react to the movement, not with fear, not with distraction. His focus remained fixed, unwavering, as if he had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. "Officer Delaney," Briggs said quietly, his voice controlled but carrying authority, "you are asking to interrupt a formal burial." The words hung there, not as a reprimand, but as a statement of gravity, and Mark met his gaze without hesitation, his expression steady. "No, sir," he replied. "I am asking you to trust the one partner in this field who has never been wrong." And for a second, that answer did not feel like defiance. It felt like truth. The wind shifted again, brushing lightly against the flag, causing it to ripple just enough to draw every eye back to the coffin, and in that shared glance, something fragile broke, the unspoken agreement that everything was already known, already settled. Briggs exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the open air, and then he turned slightly, addressing the 2 nearest officers with a nod. "Stand by," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the instruction carried weight, and immediately, the posture of the formation changed, not relaxed, but alert, as if they had stepped into a different kind of duty. Rex moved again, this time pressing closer to the coffin, his nose aligning with the center panel, and he let out a soft, insistent whine, not loud enough to disturb, but impossible to ignore, a sound that seemed to say, "This is it. This is where you need to look." Mark felt the tension in the leash again, but he did not pull back. Instead, he allowed it, trusting the direction, trusting the signal, the way he had been trained to do, the way experience had taught him to do when logic fell short. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously, his gloved hand hovering near the edge of the flag, hesitating just enough to show the weight of the moment, because this was not routine, this was not procedure, this was something else entirely, something that crossed into the unknown. "Sir," the officer said quietly, glancing back at Briggs for confirmation, and Briggs held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a single, decisive nod. The movement that followed was slow, deliberate, respectful, the flag lifted just enough to reveal more of the coffin's surface, the polished wood catching the muted light, smooth and unbroken. And yet, as the fabric shifted, Rex reacted instantly, his body tightening, his head lowering closer, his nose drawing in another deep breath, sharper this time, more certain. A ripple moved through the line of officers, subtle but undeniable, a shared awareness that something was not aligning the way it should, that something about this moment did not match the finality they had all accepted. Mark stepped closer, now standing almost beside the coffin, his eyes moving between Rex and the wood beneath his hand, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last, and yet none of them strong enough to dismiss what was happening right in front of him. Rex placed his paw against the same spot again, firmer this time, not striking, not scratching, just holding it there, marking it with quiet insistence. And then he looked up at Mark, their eyes meeting for a brief second, and in that look, there was no confusion, no doubt, only certainty. The kind of certainty that did not come from assumption, but from knowing. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if even the space around them was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. And Mark realized then that whatever they were about to uncover, it would not just change this moment, it would change everything that led up to it. Briggs stepped forward one final time, his voice low but firm. "Open it," he said, and just like that, the line between ceremony and truth disappeared. The sound of the latch releasing was softer than anyone expected, a small, almost fragile click that seemed out of place in a moment carrying so much weight. And yet it echoed louder than any command, because it marked the point where belief gave way to truth. The officer nearest the coffin hesitated only a fraction of a second before lifting the lid slowly, carefully, as if even now there was a part of him that hoped everything inside would match what they had been told, what they had prepared themselves to accept. But as the lid rose inch by inch, the air shifted, subtle at first, then undeniable. Rex stepped forward immediately, not rushing, not lunging, but closing the distance with a quiet urgency, his nose lifting toward the opening, drawing in the scent with a focus that bordered on reverence. And Mark followed just behind him, his eyes fixed on the space being revealed, his breath held without realizing it. The interior of the coffin came into view gradually, the lining pristine, the arrangement precise, everything placed exactly as it should have been. And yet, as the lid reached its full extension, something did not settle the way it should, something did not complete the picture they had all expected to see. The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of ceremony, it was something heavier, something uncertain, the kind of silence that forms when reality does not match memory. Rex let out a low, steady sound, not loud, not panicked, but firm, and he leaned closer, his nose hovering just above the interior, tracing the air rather than the surface. And then he pulled back slightly, his ears twitching, his posture tightening again. Mark felt it instantly, that shift from searching to knowing, and his gaze sharpened as he looked more closely, not at what was there, but at what was not. The uniform inside was correct, the placement exact, the details aligned with every expectation of honor and protocol. And yet there was an absence, something subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had worked closely with another human being, something that could not be replicated with precision or care. That is not him, Mark said quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a realization that had already settled deep within him. The officers nearby exchanged glances, uncertainty rising in their expressions, because what they saw with their eyes did not immediately contradict what they believed, but what they felt in that moment began to fracture it. Rex stepped forward again, placing both front paws gently against the edge of the coffin, his nose dipping lower now, closer to the uniform, and he inhaled once more, slow and deliberate. And then he turned his head slightly away, as if rejecting the scent entirely. That movement, small as it was, carried more weight than any spoken word, because it confirmed what instinct had already declared. Captain Briggs moved closer, his composure steady but his eyes narrowed with focus, and he leaned just enough to look inside for himself, his gaze scanning the details with a precision honed over years of service, searching for something out of place, something that could explain the growing disconnect between expectation and reality. The wind brushed through again, lifting the edge of the flag just enough to reveal more of the uniform beneath, and in that brief moment, another detail emerged, subtle but significant, something that did not align with the memory of the man they believed they were honoring. Mark saw it at the same time Briggs did, a small inconsistency, not obvious to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to those who had stood beside him, worked with him, known the way he carried himself even in the smallest details. Rex let out a short, sharp bark, as if marking the discovery, and stepped back slightly, his posture no longer searching, no longer questioning, but resolved. The truth had been found, even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. The officers around them stood in silence, the weight of realization settling slowly, piece by piece, as understanding began to take shape. And in that moment, the purpose of the ceremony shifted completely, no longer about honoring a fallen officer, but about uncovering where he truly was. Mark straightened, his eyes lifting from the coffin to meet Briggs once more, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, no uncertainty left to hold him back. "Sir," he said quietly, "we buried the wrong man." And as those words settled into the cold morning air, one thing became clear. This was not an ending. It was the beginning of something no one had prepared for. For several seconds, no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because none of them were ready to accept what those words would mean once they were said out loud. And in that fragile silence, the weight of the truth settled deeper, pressing into every person standing there. Captain Briggs remained still, his gaze fixed inside the coffin, his mind working through years of protocol, reports, confirmations, signatures, every step that should have guaranteed certainty. And yet here he was, faced with something that did not fit into any procedure he had ever trusted. Slowly, he straightened, his shoulders tightening just slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but no longer certain. "Seal the area," he said, and the shift was immediate, the ceremony dissolving into something else, something quieter, more focused, officers stepping out of formation not with panic, but with purpose, their movements measured, deliberate, as if they had all stepped into a different kind of duty. Mark exhaled slowly, the cold air brushing against his lungs as he looked down at Rex. And the dog had already changed. The tension in his body no longer pointed at the coffin, but outward, his ears turning, scanning, his nose lifting again as if the answer was no longer here, but somewhere else entirely. "You already knew," Mark murmured under his breath, not expecting a response, but Rex gave one anyway. A small shift of his stance, a quiet step away from the coffin, then another, his head angled toward the far edge of the cemetery, beyond the rows of white markers, toward the tree line where the morning light struggled to break through. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but Mark saw it, and more importantly, he understood it. Rex was no longer questioning. He was redirecting. Behind them, voices began to rise, not loud, but urgent. Officers speaking in low tones, coordinating, questioning, piecing together what little they knew and what no longer made sense, and somewhere in that exchange, one word began to surface more than the others, not spoken with certainty, but with growing possibility, alive. Mark felt it hit him in the chest, not as hope, not yet, but as something that demanded action. He turned toward Briggs, who was already issuing quiet instructions, his posture firm again, but now driven by something different, not ceremony, but pursuit. "Sir," Mark said, stepping closer, "if Rex is right, then he is not here." He gestured briefly toward the coffin. "He is somewhere else." Briggs looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, then shifted his gaze to Rex, who now stood facing the edge of the grounds, still, focused, waiting. There was a long pause, just a few seconds, but it carried the weight of a decision that would change everything that followed. Then Briggs nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then we follow him," he said. The words moved through the officers like a quiet command, not shouted, not forced, but understood instantly, because there was no longer time to question instinct when it had already proven itself. Mark loosened his grip on the leash just enough, giving Rex the space to move, and the dog did not hesitate. He stepped forward, leaving the coffin behind without a glance, his path clear, his pace steady, not rushing, not uncertain, but guided by something deeper than sight. The grass beneath their feet softened as they moved away from the center of the ceremony, the air shifting slightly as they approached the outer edge of the cemetery, where the neat lines of white markers gave way to uneven ground and scattered trees, the scent of damp earth stronger here, mixed with the faint trace of pine and morning dew. Rex slowed briefly, his nose lowering closer to the ground, tracing something invisible, then lifting again as if confirming the direction. And then he continued, drawing them further from what they had believed was the end. Mark followed closely, his focus locked on the dog, every sense sharpened, every instinct engaged, because this was no longer about ceremony or protocol. This was about trust, the kind that had been built over years and proven in moments exactly like this. Behind them, the officers moved in a loose formation, not tight, not rigid, but aligned in purpose, their attention fixed ahead, on the path Rex was choosing step by step. And as the distance between them and the coffin grew, something else began to grow in its place. Not certainty, not yet, but the undeniable feeling that whatever they were walking toward, it would not only explain everything that had just happened, it would rewrite the story they thought had already been finished. Rex did not slow until the ground beneath his paws changed from soft grass to uneven soil scattered with fallen leaves, the scent of damp earth rising stronger with every step as the cemetery gave way to a thin line of trees that stood like a quiet border between what was known and what had been overlooked. His pace remained steady, not rushed, not hesitant, each movement guided by something invisible but undeniable, and Mark stayed close behind, the leash loose now, no longer a restraint but a connection, a silent agreement to follow wherever this path led. The air felt different here, cooler, shaded, carrying faint traces of pine and something else beneath it, something Rex continued to track with unwavering focus. Behind them, the officers spread out slightly, their formation adapting to the terrain, boots pressing into the soft ground with muted sounds. No one speaking, no one needing to, because whatever this was, it demanded attention without distraction. Rex paused suddenly near a cluster of low brush, his body tightening again, his head lowering as he drew in a deeper breath. And then he moved to the left, circling slightly, tracing an invisible line with precision, as if narrowing down a point that only he could define. Mark watched closely, every movement familiar yet heightened, because this was no longer routine detection. This was something layered with urgency, with consequence. He has something, Mark said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. But Briggs heard it and stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the dog, his expression controlled but sharpened by growing realization. Rex stopped again, this time more firmly, his paws planted, his nose angled toward a narrow clearing just beyond the brush where the ground dipped slightly, forming a shallow depression that might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the leaves had been disturbed, faintly, subtly, but enough for trained eyes to recognize. The morning light filtered through the trees in thin beams, catching on the uneven surface, revealing a slight difference in texture, a patch where the earth had been shifted and then left to settle. Rex let out a low, focused sound. Not a bark, not a whine, but something in between, and he stepped forward, closing the last few feet with deliberate care before stopping at the edge of the depression. He did not dig, he did not claw. Instead, he stood there, still, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if confirming what he already knew. Mark felt a tightening in his chest again, a quiet anticipation mixed with something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and he crouched down beside Rex, his hand resting lightly against the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady tension beneath the fur. "This is it, isn't it?" he whispered, and Rex responded with a slight shift, his body leaning forward just enough to reaffirm the point. Briggs stepped closer now, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth as he looked down at the disturbed ground, his gaze scanning the area with careful attention, noting the subtle signs, the uneven layer of leaves, the faint indentation that did not match the natural flow of the terrain. He turned his head slightly, addressing the nearest officers in a low, controlled voice. "Careful," he said. "We do this slow." And immediately, the men around him adjusted, moving with precision, with restraint, as if the ground itself required respect. One of the officers knelt down, brushing aside a thin layer of leaves with gloved hands, revealing darker soil beneath, soil that had not settled fully, and the moment it was exposed, Rex's posture shifted again, his focus intensifying, his breath steady but deeper, as if the scent had grown stronger. Mark watched closely, his eyes moving between the dog and the ground, every instinct telling him that whatever lay beneath that surface would answer the question they had all been carrying since the coffin had been opened. The air felt heavier here, quieter, the sounds of the cemetery now distant, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves and the slow, careful movement of hands against soil. And as the first layer was gently moved aside, revealing more of what had been hidden, one thing became impossible to ignore. This was not random. This was not coincidence. This was a trail, and Rex had followed it not to a memory, not to grief, but to the truth they had been meant to find. The soil gave way slowly under careful hands, each movement deliberate, respectful, as if whatever lay beneath deserved patience as much as urgency. And the deeper they uncovered, the more the air seemed to shift, thick with something unspoken, something waiting. Rex remained perfectly still at the edge, his eyes fixed, his breathing steady but deeper now, as though every inch of exposed earth confirmed what he had already known long before anyone else had begun to understand. Mark stayed crouched beside him, one hand resting lightly along Rex's back, feeling the tension, the focus, the quiet certainty that had led them here step by step. A few more inches of soil were brushed aside, revealing something unnatural beneath the surface, not rough, not broken, but shaped, structured, something that did not belong to the randomness of earth and leaves. "Hold," Briggs said softly, raising a hand, and immediately the movement stopped. every officer freezing in place as if the ground itself had asked them to pause. The outline became clearer now, faint but unmistakable, the edge of something covered, something concealed just beneath the layer of disturbed soil, and as the light filtered down through the trees, it caught the surface in a way that made it stand apart from everything around it. Rex let out a low sound again, deeper this time. Not warning, not fear, but confirmation, and he took a single step closer, just enough to close the last gap between instinct and discovery. Mark felt his pulse steady into focus, the kind that came not from panic but from clarity, and he looked up briefly at Briggs, who gave a small nod, the kind that said continue, but carefully. The officers resumed, slower now, hands moving with precision, brushing away the remaining soil until the object beneath began to take form, not large, not imposing, but undeniable, a hidden presence placed just far enough from sight to avoid notice, but not far enough to escape a trained instinct. As the final layer of dirt was cleared, the shape revealed itself more fully, and with it came a realization that moved through the group without words, because no one needed to say it for it to be understood. This was not a mistake, not an accident. This had been placed here, deliberately, intentionally, as if someone had wanted it hidden but not lost. Rex shifted slightly, lowering his head closer, his nose hovering just above the surface, drawing in the scent again. And this time he did not pull back. He stayed there, steady, certain, as if anchoring himself to the truth that lay just beneath. Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the revealed shape, every detail beginning to align with the questions that had formed since the coffin had been opened. And in that alignment, something deeper took hold, something that felt less like confusion and more like direction. This is connected, he said quietly, the words almost lost in the stillness. But Briggs heard them and did not disagree, because the evidence was no longer subtle. It was forming a path, a line that stretched from the coffin to this hidden place, and whatever lay beneath was a part of that line. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, but now it carried something else as well, something that Rex had followed from the very beginning, something that tied this place to everything they had just uncovered. The officers exchanged brief glances, not questioning, but acknowledging, because the moment had shifted again, from uncertainty to revelation, and though they had not yet seen everything, they had seen enough to know that the story they had been given was incomplete. Rex remained at the center of it all, unmoving, unwavering, his presence steady like a compass pointing toward a truth no one else had been able to find. And as the last traces of soil were cleared away, one thing became certain. Whatever they were about to uncover next would not only explain why Rex had refused to accept the coffin, it would lead them directly to the man they had not yet lost. The final layer came away with a soft, deliberate motion, and what lay beneath did not reveal itself all at once, but in pieces, in edges and lines that slowly formed into something unmistakably real, something that did not belong hidden beneath soil and leaves. And as the shape became clear, a quiet realization moved through the group, not spoken, but deeply understood. It was a compact emergency field kit, sealed, weather-worn but intact, the kind issued only to active officers in high-risk assignments, the kind that carried more than tools. It carried identity, presence, proof. Rex stepped closer the moment it was fully uncovered, lowering his head until his nose nearly touched it, inhaling once, long and steady. And this time he did not hesitate, did not question. He held there, as if anchoring himself to something he recognized completely. Mark felt it immediately, the shift from uncertainty to confirmation, and his voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. This is his, he said, not as a guess, not as a theory, but as something he knew. Captain Briggs knelt beside the kit, his gloved hands moving carefully, opening it with measured precision, and inside, neatly arranged despite the concealment, were items that left no room for doubt: a badge, a folded identification card, and a worn but unmistakable tag bearing the name Daniel Hayes. The air seemed to pause around them, as if even the world itself needed a moment to adjust to what this meant. Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling in his chest. He was here, he said, his eyes moving from the kit to the surrounding area. already beginning to read the scene not as an ending, but as a passage, a point along a path. Rex lifted his head and turned slightly, not back toward the cemetery, not toward the coffin, but further beyond the clearing, his ears rising again, his body aligning with a new direction. And this time there was no hesitation at all, only forward focus. Briggs rose to his feet, his posture shifting fully now from ceremony to command. "We are not done here," he said quietly, and the officers around him moved in response. Not hurried, not chaotic, but precise, each one understanding that the mission had changed. Mark stood and gave Rex a subtle signal, and the dog moved immediately, stepping past the clearing, past the place where the hidden kit had been found, continuing along a faint, nearly invisible trail that only he seemed able to follow. The ground sloped slightly downward beyond the trees, leading toward a narrow service path that ran along the outer edge of the cemetery, a path rarely used, partially covered by leaves and shadow, but just clear enough to suggest recent passage. Rex slowed briefly at the edge, his nose lowering again, confirming, tracing, then lifting as he fixed on a point further down the path, and then he moved forward with quiet urgency. Mark followed, his focus sharp, every sense aligned with the dog's movement, and behind them, the team adjusted formation once more, spreading slightly to cover the terrain, their attention fixed ahead. The air carried a different scent here, lighter, mixed with the faint trace of asphalt from a nearby road, and as they moved along the path, the distance between them and the cemetery grew, the silence of the burial ground replaced by the quiet presence of something still unfolding. Rex's pace remained steady, not frantic, not searching blindly, but guided, as if each step brought him closer to something he already understood. Mark's mind moved through the possibilities, each one shaped by what they had just found: the kit, the absence in the coffin, the trail leading away, and all of it pointed in one direction, not loss, but survival. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly, allowing more light to break through, and just beyond that light, something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough for Rex to react, his body tightening, his pace slowing, his focus narrowing once more. Mark saw it then, just beyond the edge of the path, a faint movement, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. And in that moment, everything aligned. The refusal at the coffin, the trail, the hidden kit, all of it leading here. Rex took one final step forward and stopped, his posture calm now, no longer tense, no longer urgent, and he let out a soft, steady breath, as if the search had ended. Mark moved past him slowly, his eyes fixed ahead, and there, standing just beyond the light, was a figure, worn, steady, very much alive, and for a moment, no one spoke, because no words were needed to understand what had just been found. Rex stepped forward once more, closing the final distance, and this time, there was no resistance, no warning, only recognition, and as he reached him, the man lowered his hand, resting it gently against the dog's head, a simple gesture, quiet, steady, and in that silence, the truth settled completely. Some bonds do not break, they guide, they protect, and sometimes, they bring you back when the world has already said goodbye.